when they go up out of the colony, they do a little circle around the colony to figure out where they are, and then they head in the direction of where they've been before to collect food.
And they can adjust that as well for the time of day as the sun is moving.
Yes.
That is incredible.
It is incredible. I agree with you. You know, these things are things that make our life richer, right? The beauty of the natural world is life itself.
Thank you so much, Jeri, for joining me on the podcast. And well, I'm really, really excited to dive in. I think what's really cool about bees is that we all sort of have a bee story, right? We all have an understanding of bees. We all have a memory of where we stung, when we almost stung. There was that time where it went up my skirt, and you know, we've all got this kind of relationship with bees. But you're an insect neuroethologist at Oxford, right? Perfect.
That's correct.
And so I guess you see them a completely different way. How did you sort of get into thinking about bees and getting interested in bees?
I started with an interest in insects because I was interested in their relationship with plants. My undergraduate degree is in botany, and plants and insects have a really complicated and long and very fascinating history. And it was a natural step for me to start with herbivores, which are the ones that destroy plants. They're really important for agriculture. We spend a lot of money trying to develop means of destroying them because of our crops. And I was really interested in the chemical defenses of plants and how plants try to prevent herbivores from eating leaves. And that's what I studied when I was a graduate student here at the University of Oxford. I had the opportunity to change direction when I was a postdoc, and I went to study bee biology at Ohio State University with Brian Smith. And he was studying the bee's sense of smell. So it was a pretty big change from what I had been doing to a completely new organism doing something totally different. But it was a very lucky change, I would say, because bees are really fascinating for many different reasons. There are all kinds of things that you can study about their biology. You're not limited to their interaction with plants, but it's still something that I've pursued during my academic career, was trying to understand this relationship between bees and plants and how bees meet their nutritional needs from the floral resources produced by plants like nectar and pollen, but also how plants manipulate bees to do what they want, which is to have sex, basically. So it's interesting from both perspectives. Bees need food, plants need sex, and bees are a great vector for sex for them.
It's incredible. I mean, when you think about like diving into this world of the way that they see, how do they see plants? How do they sort of interact with them? Give us the basics and then dive into something.
So we think that this relationship between plants and insect pollinators evolved about 120 million years ago. And that it evolved from cycadic type plants, which are these kind of ancient looking palmish things that were wind pollinated, and beetles that would consume the pollen and move from one plant to the next and eat pollen. Pollen is very rich. Pollen has a lot of protein, it has a lot of fat, it has all kinds of interesting antioxidants in it. And these are things that the male gamete of the plant need when it lands on the stigma of a receptive flower, because that helps to fuel the sperm, basically, to make its way to the ovary. So pollen is a really rich source of nutrients, and it's not surprising in a way that insects would want to eat it, because it's really quite good. You don't need to eat a lot of it to get what you need. Right. So That's how we think this started in evolutionary history. And bees are evolved from a lineage of wasps. They were related to parasitoid wasps that sting insect prey and lay an egg in it or put venom in it and then take the prey back to feed to their larvae. It's quite grim, actually. The parasitoid wasps are like the aliens of the insect world. You know, the female lays the egg in the caterpillar, and then the egg eats the inside of the caterpillar out and pops out, you know, as an adult. It's grim.
There are still species that do that, right?
Oh, there are loads, millions.
Right.
So, yeah. But bees evolved from this lineage. We actually think they evolved from a type of wasp which predates spiders, so spheccid wasps, which do exactly that. They I don't know if you've seen these spider hunting wasps. They find a spider, they use their ovipositor, which is like the sharp stinger barb at the end of their abdomen, to inject venom into the spider, and then the spider gets inert, and the live but paralyzed spider gets dragged off to a burrow where the wasp feeds it to its larva. So it's grim. But bees have these same sorts of traits, though. They have an ovipositor with a venom which they can use, but they have adapted to a totally different purpose, although it is used for defense in the case of the honeybee. They have many of these same traits. Now, plants produce pollen to reproduce. It's the male gamete. The female gamete is found in the ovary. The plants, their fitness is increased by outcrossing. So in any species that has sex basically is sharing genes. And this diversity of genes makes it possible for there to be diversity in the phenotypes of a species, which allow them to adapt to changing environmental conditions or to colonize new places, to overcome mutations. There are many good reasons to want to be able to outcross. And if an insect lands on a plant and it gets pollen on itself, and then it goes to another plant of the same species, and it takes that pollen and it deposits it on the plant, it's quite an efficient way of getting pollen from one place to another. And so an insect vector doesn't take a lot of pollen, a little bit's there, but it's gone to, let's say, 20 different plants in the space of an hour. And it may have deposited some pollen grains on every one of those, meaning that the potential for sex is like having sex with 20 different individuals that then have your offspring. So it really increases the potential for outcrossing in a plant population, which drives speciation in plant populations as well. So diversification and speciation. And there was this huge increase in plant diversity that happened about 80 million years ago called the eudicot diversification. And we think that bees becoming pollinators was simultaneous with this eudicot diversification. In other words, bees started switching to eating pollen and using it to provision their larvae, and at that time they started to drive diversification in plants. Because they are such efficient vectors of outcrossing and of fertilization, it means you don't have to produce very much pollen to be able to have sex with all these individuals. And that's in contrast to your basic pine tree, which is wind pollinated and which produces just tons of pollen in the springtime, right? So it has to saturate the air with pollen in order that it might have a pollen grain land on a receptive stigma of another plant. So you can see that actually there's a huge advantage to a plant to having a little insect vector transmitting pollen from one flower to the next.
Doing the job for it, right?
Right? And so what happened is, you get this situation where it becomes beneficial for an animal to get its nutrient needs met by this plant's pollen. So it goes there, and the plants that are able to do this outcrossing then can outcompete other plants. So they have these traits which attract the pollinators, and the pollinators themselves actually drive those traits. And one of the important traits that was basically driven by pollinators was the production of nectar. So nectar is produced by flowers for no other reason than to attract a bee pollinator or an insect pollinator. It's a gift from the plant to say, come over here. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And so, and it's fuel. So it actually also is a very rich gift that helps the pollinator to be able to fuel flight, because flight's very expensive. So it takes a lot of energy, and it really, especially if you're going out and visiting a lot of plants, and you're not really investing your energy in your offspring. So it really is a very, it's co-evolved both to fuel pollinators and to attract them to come to the plant in the first place. So it's very interesting to look at the composition of nectar and to find out more about it, and what it is that plants do to bring their pollinators closer, right? To attract as many and the most efficient pollinators that they can get. Because very often it's about efficiency, really. They don't want to give up a lot of pollen to do their outcrossing. They don't really want the pollinator even to eat the pollen, because it's their, it's their sperm, basically. So it's expensive. Nectar's cheap. So a plant can produce tons of carbohydrates, and it does so all the time through photosynthesis. But pollen's full of protein and fats, which are much more expensive to produce. So there's a kind of trade-off there. On the other hand, bees are very good pollinators. So in some cases, you will see that there are plant species where they don't actually produce nectar as a gift for a pollinator, but their pollen is produced in copious amounts, and it's very rich and available for a short time. So the pollinators really seek it, and they really want it. And an orchid is a very good example of that. The pollinator doesn't necessarily eat the pollen of an orchid, but the orchid has this packet that it smacks onto the back of a pollinator. It doesn't produce a lot of pollen, but just a little, and that's it has a very special mechanism for transporting that pollen packet to another flower of the same species.
So do bees have favorite kinds of species that they'll go to, or are bees in certain parts of the world healthier or able to get more of the different kinds of nutrients, or is it kind of general, like how we eat, our diets are different, but there are multiple ways?
That's a really great question that people are trying to answer now.
Right.
It's a really, really great question. So I think it's a bit of both. And it depends on the bee species. Some species have specialized on the floral resources produced by only a few different kinds of plants, but there are drawbacks to doing this. Flowers are ephemeral, right? They come and go, and they're not present all the time necessarily, unless you're in the tropics. There's some plant species flower all the time. So if you choose to specialize on a certain plant species, it has to be abundant, it has to be present, it has to be enough to support a population of animals. But there are some species in the temperate zone which have specialized on a discrete number of plant species. And that's because it's a little niche that they can colonize where they don't have to compete with other pollinators for access to those resources.
Right, okay.
Most pollinators, like your average honeybee, they are generalists and they will take what they can get. But even generalists don't eat everything. So there are some pollen which is toxic, which have nasty compounds, or is spiky and nasty, and they don't like to collect it, and they won't collect it, or it's just not very nutritious. And there are some types of pollen that they will go crazy for, that they love the smell of, that has compounds that they need, that they'll compete to get to. And I've seen I've seen bees on a cucumber flower or a squash blossom in a scrum to try to get to the pollen. They throw each other off trying to grab the pollen. It's amazing. The same also of coffee flowers, actually. I was quite interested in coffee plants, and for a number of different reasons, which I can tell you later. But coffee must have very good pollen, because the pollinators that come to coffee flowers get in a scrum, and I have some video footage of this. It's really quite funny.
I'd love to see that. If you could send that would be so cool.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
So, this relationship between plants and pollinators is nuanced. It's evolved over millions of years. It's really beautiful, and it's what's driven diversification of floral signals. So that's originally what I had been interested to study. I wanted to know more, and the lab that I was in was interested in floral scent and how bees learn about floral scent. How can they distinguish the scent of one species flowers from another species flowers, and how does their brain work? That was really what I was interested in, because the olfactory systems of insects and mammals are very similar in terms of their structure and design, which means that you can study an insect, and the principles that you learn about the olfactory system in an insect can really elucidate a lot about what's happening in a mammal. And you don't have to do all the horrible kind of nasty surgery to the mouse to understand it.
So when you say floral scents, they are smelling it in a similar way to we do?
They have an olfactory system that is set up in a way that allows them to perceive scent that is similar to the way that our olfactory system operates. Now, it may not smell the same to them, right? This is a bit of the sort of the philosophical question about, do you see green the same way that I do? But
right.
And in fact, they have different receptors and different numbers of receptors and a slightly different configuration. But it's not. It is fundamentally its design is similar in principle. So the circuits that are part of the brain that allows us to do an olfactory computation that tells us that this is Chanel number 5 are the same in the bee. They have they're doing the same kind of thing with that complex blend to form a percept, which is greater than the sum of its parts.
Wow. I mean, is there other ways that they're sort of communicating or working with flowers that we wouldn't really be able to understand?
I think their visual system is quite different. So I think that we know that they see colors differently, that they have four different sensitivities to 4 different wavelengths. We have 3, they have 4. So they probably see colors and flowers and the structure of flowers in a way that's like dazzling and much more intense than we do.
Right. Is there interpretations of that, like online? Can we have?
There are actually. Lars Chitka has studied this, and I believe he's at Queen Mary University of London, and he has some models for it. And actually, I believe he's written some reviews about that. If you were interested. He might be somebody that you'd be interested to talk to.
Yeah, probably. I think so.
Yeah.
I'll have a look at that. So, I mean, so the fourth way that they see the world is just more? I mean, how does that work?
It's basically, it gives them our visual system, and again, you'll have to forgive me, I'm not a visual neuroscientist, and so I'm probably saying all of this incorrectly. We have cones which are sensitive to 3 different wavelengths, basically, over a very wide spectrum. They're tuned to a specific wavelength, but they also perceive others. And it's the combination of these 3 that allows us to see the colors that we see. They're assembled by our brain. So the receptors in our retina respond to these wavelengths of light, and the impulses that are sent from the retina and what's behind it are then assembled into color that our brain perceives. Okay, it's very complicated actually. It's not straightforward. What happens at the periphery is not what happens up here. So there's a whole bunch of computation that goes on.
Right.
In bees, imagine that you have a sensitivity to yet another wavelength. It means basically that you have a finer grained definition of color. It means that your blue-greens are going to be more bluey and more greeny, and they might have something that's totally different that we can't even imagine. Like a turquoisey, ultraviolet, weird color, right? That we just can't imagine because we see and colors are already defined for us. Yeah. So they just have there are some insects or actually other arthropods which have 9 different types of cone. Yeah, stomatopods are very sensitive to color, and they live in the sea, but not so far under the sea that they don't get to all the wavelengths of light. And but they have these incredibly complex visual displays, and sexual selection in that case has probably driven that between the members of that species. Right, they're using these signals to see each other. In bees, it's the color vision that they have is definitely been driven by the floral signals produced by plants.
So it's something about plants and the way that they look, if we were able to see all of these different kinds of wavelengths, that has changed the way that the bees have to navigate the world. Yeah,
so a flower is a billboard advertisement of food, basically. Saying, come here and take this nectar, and I'm right here, come over here. And because plants are competing for the attention of pollinators, the big billboard with the beautiful scent and the bright nectar guides and the, you know, strong colors and the shape and everything, all those things, they are an advertisement from afar so the bee can see it. And when the bee lands there, they're getting this huge visual sensory overload, right, of information which they're using, which which helps them to form a memory of the quality of the experience that they have. So imagine that you're a customer and you're buying something and you have this chocolate and it's accompanied by this visual display and this sensory, this, you know, this beautiful smell, and you have this chocolate. And there are loads of chocolate vendors and they want to entice you to come and spend your money, but you can't buy from all of them, you're just going to buy from one, right? So the plant wants to help you to remember that their chocolate is best, okay? So they do that with visual display, they do it with scent, and they do it with the quality of the food that they give to you too. So it's all of these things all at once trying to sell you, come back over here. Okay, they're
not
selling
like our billboards where it's branding and something like that.
They're selling the same thing. It's the same thing. It's ultimately sex for the plant. For us, we get enticed into it believing that we're going to be more rich, more beautiful, more this, more healthy, right? So it's the same kind of sales that's happening, right? It's the use of sensory signaling to manipulate the outcome for the one that's doing the signaling. And so visual displays of flowers, they definitely have been driven by pollinators. And in part, they are colors that those pollinators like. They are easy for them to see. They are easy to distinguish from other plants. And so plants might want to be able to infiltrate the signals of other plants, especially if they're cheap and they don't want to produce a lot of nectar. If they have a signal that looks a lot like another plant that produces loads of nectar, a cheap way to get visitation is to, you know, just have a similar visual signal. And then if there's a lot of competition, you get drift from the pollinator population into that plant population and you get your outcrossing for nothing.
Right,
so
like
happens.
an own brand rip-off.
Yes, exactly.
Still, people will still buy it.
Yeah, so there are orchids that do this. Even in the UK, there are orchids that do this, that produce no nectar, but they have a visual display that's quite attractive to a bee. So, and plants like this often live in areas where it's very hard to survive. So, you know, they're in this trade-off constantly, you know, between what they have to do to have sex versus, you know, what they have to do to produce seeds. So,
right.
And that's the same trade-off every organism faces, basically.
Right. Yes. How much of sort of like fruit and vegetables are floral and bees work with, or is it percentage-wise for the bees? Is it more sort of flowers like orchids, or you were talking earlier about sort of cucumbers and things like that?
So agronomists estimate that approximately 1/3 of all the food we eat needs some form of pollination by an insect pollinator of some kind. So all your nut crops, fruits, vegetables, all of these things are...
All of it?
All of them. But tomatoes,
right,
cherries, strawberries, almonds, they're all produced by pollination. But cereal crops, they are mainly from the grass family, and they are wind pollinated. So most cereals, you know, we eat a lot of cereal to survive. So they are not dependent on pollination. But a lot of the things that we care about, because they're highly nutritious, they taste good, and they're an important part of our diet, are pollinated. Coffee, for example, is something that is pollinated by insects. Almonds are dependent on insect pollination. You don't set seed in an almond crop unless a pollinator visits the plant. So, and it's a huge industry in California.
Yes, I think I've heard about it. And for the bees, does it make up a large part of their diet, or are they quite happy if they are 100% on flowers?
So, a particular plant species pollen may not have all the nutrients that a particular pollinator would need. So some plant species pollen is very rich and has a lot of protein, but it may not have the right kind of fat. Other plant species might have the right kinds of fats, but not be very proteinaceous. Others might still have antioxidants with the that the insect needs, which help it to combat viruses or other kinds of pathogen. So the few studies that have addressed this have shown that a mixed floral diet for a honeybee colony improves its health. And we believe that it's because most plant species pollen is not quite sufficient. But that's not entirely true. There are some plant species that have quite good pollen, and if they can just collect enough of it, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, the best strategy is to diversify, to collect as much as you can in the environment, and for as long as you can. Because, again, flowers are ephemeral. They only last for a short period. You exploit that resource, and then you move to a different species. And this ephemerality, combined with this diet of floral resources, has driven the brain of bees to become something really quite special. So most insects, they can learn, they can do what they need to do, but bees are very smart, and bees learn and remember floral cues very quickly, and they retain that memory for quite a long time. So, and they've done that, they've evolved that ability in order to exploit those resources when they are present. And they come back and they communicate that within the colony. So in a honeybee colony, it's a highly evolved organism where you have individuals going out into the landscape, learning floral signals, collecting loads of food, bringing it back, and then telling everyone else where to go. So they actually developed a language that communicates both direction and distance to a floral source and its quality. So they do this waggle dance where they vigorously dance, and during the dance they are communicating how good the food is. So they waggle harder when it's better.
I've heard of this. They are able to communicate what direction and how far, but also how good what it is out there. So it's not just like, oh, there's a little bit over in that direction about a mile away. It's like, oh, we need to go that way.
Fast.
Right. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
That's so incredible. I mean, one thing that this made me think of. So yes, they are seeing things differently, probably smelling things, tasting things differently to us. But I mean, I don't know if it's just because I use Google Maps all the time, but I get lost so much. How do bees navigate the world? Do they have another sense, or are they just because they're just really skilled at it in some ways?
It is in part skill, right? They do learn landmarks, but they also rely. Yeah, they can learn landmarks. Yeah.
So they can say there's a lake right there, and there's some goodies around it.
I'm not sure how well they can communicate those landmarks when they do the waggle dance, but they learn them, right, in their own memory. But they use the sun to orient, and that's how the waggle dance is calculated within the colony. So they can see polarized light. It's difficult for us to see polarized light. We don't rely on it. Polarized light means directional light. And if you buy, special sunglasses with nice lenses, you will buy polarized sunglasses, which basically they take out all the scattered light and they let only in the photons which are traveling in the same direction. And so bees have eyes that allow them to perceive the direction of light, the polarization of light from the sun, and they use this then to orient with respect to the position of the sun and the horizon, and they can communicate the direction based on what they learn about the position of the sun relative to a food source. So when they go up out of the colony, they do a little circle around the colony to figure out where they are, and then they head in the direction of where they've been before to collect food.
And they can adjust that as well for the time of day as the sun is moving.
Yes.
That is incredible.
It is incredible. I agree with you. And Carl von Frisch won the Nobel Prize because he figured it out.
How did he figure that out? When was this? How long ago? Have we known?
Well, he did most of his work in the 1930s and 40s. And in the 20s, actually, he was a lecturer in Austria in the 1920s. And he actually, if it's true that he did most of his research in the 1920s, but he carried on in the 30s and 40s. He didn't win the Nobel Prize until 1970, and he shared that with Nicholas Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz. I always forget Konrad Lorenz. But they were studying animal behavior too. And
Wow.
Konrad Lorenz was studying imprinting behavior in chicks, and
Oh,
Nico
right.
Tinbergen was studying sign stimuli and instinct in birds and in other insects
Right.
like wasps.
Right. So this is when we started breaking through this deeper understanding into worlds of animal behavior that we didn't
Yeah,
really
their
even
research
account
was
for.
really pushing what we knew about and understood about the animal brain, and showing that animals do quite sophisticated things. Even
Mm,
bees do quite sophisticated things. They were always thought to be like little robots, but they are definitely not
yeah.
robots.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was
At
gonna
least not
ask. So,
robots in the most primitive sense. Robots now
yeah.
are
Yeah.
becoming so sophisticated that they'll be more like us before we know it.
Yes, that is true, and they're going to be able to learn better than us, and maybe better than the bees. So, you said that they come back and they communicate, and they also have the ability to remember things. How long do bees live? How many generations can there be in one hive? Like, is a generational sharing and long-term memory a part of it, or is it all quite new each time?
That's a great question, and it's a question I think that there's not a deeply satisfying answer to. The easy answer to it is that each generation's learning this information anew.
Mm-hmm.
There are some things which are transmitted and which are encoded basically through selection, genetic selection, but as individuals, when they are learning about food and where to find that food and things like that, that happens basically every generation that comes through.
Mm.
Your average worker honeybee lives maybe a month,
Oh,
so
really?
it takes approximately 21 days to grow to an adult, and it will be another 21 days of adulthood probably that they'll live in midsummer, because they stay in the colony for about 2 weeks, and then that final week that they go out to forage is quite intense. They can probably live maybe longer than 1 week, but if they're foraging intensely, it wears them out. Their wings wear out. It's metabolically expensive, and they'll eventually die from it.
Right.
Yeah, it's very treacherous for a bee to collect food. It's hard work. The weather's bad. There are lots
Mm.
of predators. There are all kinds of things that can kill you.
And they can go a significant distance, right?
Yeah, they can go 5 kilometers from their colony to collect food. So it's a very physically demanding thing to do.
Mm.
But the things that they learn, they transmit within the colony through the waggle dance. The others learn it through their experience, and they come back and communicate it. But they don't have a written record, basically, of history. Any history that they carry with them is imprinted basically through their genes. There are some researchers who are interested to know how immune challenge has affected a queen, because a queen is the longest lived individual in the colony, and she can live up to 3 years. If she's a strong queen and the colony's strong, that queen can live for
Okay.
many generations of bees. But
So she hibernates over the winter within a colony and a
yes,
few bees.
yeah, so several hundred will. I mean, most of the bees try to live over the winter. Many die from the cold. They die from
Mm-hmm.
starvation. But they stay together in a tight bundle and produce heat. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how they stay warm through the winter, and they have stored honey, so they eat the honey to shiver and stay warm, and they protect the queen.
Okay. And then is there any sort of research into what she can share with a colony the next time and the next time, or people
So there
working
is
on that?
some information that some researchers on bee health are trying to understand about how immune challenge to that queen can be transmitted to her offspring
Mm-hmm.
to essentially prime them to be more protected. The same way that colostrum in a mammal is basically an immune priming of a mammalian mother to her child or her offspring through her milk. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still early days. There's some evidence that that's the case, but I would say that's really the only form of memory that I can pinpoint where you would say you would be getting a cross-generational transmission of information.
Right. How can we even test for that? How can you even test to see like what is being learned and what is sort of instinctual in something that only lives for a month or 6 weeks?
So, do you know Pavlov's dog and the story of Pavlov?
The salivating dog.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
So Pavlov was really one of the first people to very carefully study learning in animals, and or learning in anything really. And he trained dogs to salivate expecting food when he rang a bell. So he'd ring the bell, give them some food, ring food, and then whenever the dog heard that bell, start to salivate. And he would keep them hungry, right, so that he could measure, that they were salivating. And that type of conditioning where you have a signal that the animal perceives, in that case an auditory stimulus, and a food, which is a meaningful stimulus to which you have an instinctual response. The ability of the brain to make the pairing between that sensory signal that previously had no meaning and the food, which is something that you are born knowing is food, is called simple associative learning. And the ability to do that most animals have, because it's very adaptive. You have to be able to predict where you're going to be able to find food, and if there are cues that you can associate with the presence of food and its abundance, then you are more adapted to an environment. You can exploit that food faster and better. And that's essentially what bees are doing when they're out flying around visiting flowers. They see a flower, they visit it, they see if there's food there. If there is, and it's good, they associate the visual and olfactory cues that are present there with the presence of food. And they do it very quickly. So a dog may, if you've ever tried to train a dog, dogs take a while to train to do anything. In part because they're fat. Most pets are fat.
Yeah.
But
they're cool.
Yeah.
They don't need to do anything.
Yeah, exactly. But a foraging honeybee can learn in one trial. In 3 trials, she'll learn and form a long-lasting memory. So that means basically one experience of a sensory cue associated with food, and she's learned it. After 3 times of the same, boom, she'll remember it tomorrow. And so they're very good at doing that simple form of learning where you have these cues and they can learn, okay, what's the quality of this food that's associated with that. They are interesting because they have a brain that allows them to make quite complicated decisions about the various visual and olfactory signals that they perceive. So they can smell and sense very fine differences in those sensory signals. And they can also perform. My lab and several others have been trying to understand what are the limits of this little brain. What kind of sophisticated types of learning can they do? And can they form abstract rules that allow them to make a judgment about similar or different, which is something we do all the time and take for granted.
How far does that reach? Yeah. So, I mean, because the world is really different now, I suppose, for bees. I mean, are you finding that they're having to make really difficult decisions, between whether this thing that looks like a flower is actually plastic or that kind of thing? Like what are you learning?
I'm not sure that the anthropogenic change in landscape use has challenged them cognitively so much as it may be challenging them to be able to find enough food in a landscape. The effort with which they have to find food and get enough to maintain a colony through the winter in a situation where the winters are more mild and the colony has to face potential poisoning by pesticides or other types of environmental contaminant. Those things physiologically challenge them and make it very difficult for bees of any species to survive. I would say really the major challenge to maintaining bee populations in any landscape is providing them with sufficient plants to have forage throughout a summer season. And without that, bees just can't find enough food to survive and to produce enough offspring or to put on enough fat to overwinter.
Yeah. So it's really a physical challenge.
It's more a physical challenge, I would say. Yeah.
So how does their in an ideal world, what kind of judgments are they having to make if there was lots of
there is one thing I
food
can
for them
say
to
though.
choose?
There is one very interesting thing that does affect their judgment and that does affect learning and memory, which is a human made compound.
Mm-hmm.
And in some flowering plant species, like oilseed rape, are defended by chemical compounds against flea beetles. Flea beetles go and destroy all the seeds that are produced for oil. It's an oil crop. And the companies that produce the seeds treat the seeds with pesticides that permeate all of the tissues of the plant. It's a very effective way of delivering a pesticide because it gets in all the tissues. You don't have to spray it everywhere, so it really stays localized mostly in the plant, although it does get into the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a huge, an important invention. But it winds up in the nectar, and it winds up in the pollen, and the compounds are compounds which are not specific to a particular type of insect, which means they can affect all insects, including visiting bees. And these particular pesticides are called neonicotinoid pesticides. Neonicotinoid refers to, neo is new, the Latin word for new, and nicotine-like pesticide. So it's a new nicotine. And this new nicotine has a target in the insect brain called an acetylcholine receptor. Now, the acetylcholine receptor is a receptor found in neurons and in muscle tissue that basically allows fast transmission of information throughout a neural circuit or through a neuromuscular junction. And its major transmitter is acetylcholine. Nicotine binds to this receptor and acts like acetylcholine, so it basically amplifies a signal. It sits on the receptor and makes everything louder.
Right. Okay.
So, and a smoker, when they smoke, they basically get a hit, and it's intensifying their sensory experience, right? And it's activating the circuits which are involved in reward in the brain. And because
so they love it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, these receptors are found everywhere in the brain, and they do all kinds of things. So you amplify everything.
Right.
And in insects, it's the same. They have these receptors all over. In fact, even more so, more diverse. And these neonicotinoids are super agonists. They're really effective on those receptors at tiny amounts. Again, makes them a great pesticide specific to insects. Doesn't affect mammals so much. When bees come into contact with these compounds in nectar, my lab actually found that it amplifies the rewarding properties of nectar. So if they drink a solution that contains neonicotinoid pesticides, they actually think the nectar is better.
Right.
And they are more likely to prefer that food source than to prefer unlaced nectar. So
they're getting addicted to the nicotinoids.
So they could be, yes. My lab is currently studying that, actually trying to determine whether over time we can, and using all of the criteria that are shown in mammals, whether you basically can addict a bee to something like a pesticide. And that's a case where something that a person has engineered does affect the learning and memory of bees in a way which is detrimental to them. Because these pesticides have lots of other effects on them that affects their ability to move and to navigate. It reduces their immune function. It has really large knock-on effects on their health, which then many papers have gone on to show are leading to bee decline. So that certainly is one case where humans have affected learning and memory in bees in a way that was not intended in the beginning, but which is having potentially very bad consequences.
Yeah. Is there work sort of on the flip side to show where we can sort of drive bees away from, say, cities or farms to sort of keep them safe by making certain areas, almost like protected areas, more attractive to bees?
Well, people are trying to plant flowering strips of plants alongside different kinds of crops to provide them with diverse pollen and nectar, so that they have more habitat. That's certainly happening. In fact, cities are a great place for for forage for bees. And there are some researchers in the UK that have shown that bees prefer to forage in the city. At Francis Ratnick's lab at the University of Sussex, I was showing that bees are actually going out to forage in cities because there's a diversity of plants that flower all year long. Jane Memmott at the University of Bristol was doing similar research and realized that urban spaces are actually quite good habitats for foraging bees, and was working on ways that we can improve floral habitat around cities to actually help bees.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, but there are a lot of people that if they found a hive in their property, would remove it, right? I mean, there's got to be work to...
It's true, but many bees, if they're just foraging there, their hive is could be kilometers off. So
right, yeah.
Even with flowers there, the foragers will come, they'll visit the flowers, and then they'll go.
How long will a 5K take a bee? How long do they go out for?
That's a question I can't answer. I should know how fast they can fly, but I don't know.
Because you work mostly in a lab, right? How does that work?
Yeah, I work in a lab.
How do you study? Do you have colonies in the lab that you study?
We work with bumblebees as well as honeybees, and we keep the bumblebees in the lab. The honeybees are kept outside so that they can feed themselves mostly. And they just don't survive very well inside. The research that I do inside, especially if it's just looking at learning and memory, we can take honeybee foragers and restrain them in a little harness. And just like Pavlov's dog, the honeybee can be trained to put its mouth parts up towards food when it smells an odor. So you can blow a little floral scent at it, give it some sugar, and its little mouth parts will come up and drink the sugar. And you can train that reflex like Pavlov's salivating dog, which has meant that we can study learning and memory in bees and really easily because they're willing to do this. You can teach them to do it in a free flight situation. It's a little more complicated, but they'll do it that way too. But you can assay many, thousands of individuals in a short time in these very controlled conditions in a laboratory setting. If you're interested to understand the mechanisms of learning and memory.
Yeah, and literally put a little harness around them.
Yeah, so we used to use a drinking straw that was modified. So we cut the straw and then put a piece of gaffer tape in to hold the bee in place, and then train the bee to learn to associate scent with food.
Yeah. You mentioned coffee earlier, and I mean, do coffee plants, flowers have? Do they give off caffeine or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really curious question. I was interested in addiction for a long time before I started studying pesticides. In part because, as I told you before, I was interested in the plants or the compounds that plants produce to keep herbivores from eating them.
Yeah,
and a lot of the compounds that we like nicotine, like caffeine, these compounds are actually defensive compounds produced by plants to prevent herbivores from eating them. At low concentrations, they make us feel good. At high concentrations, they could kill us.
Right.
So I was interested to know if some of these compounds that are produced by plants can be perceived by bees, and if they have some kind of pharmacological effect on the brain. And so I started studying this intensively about 15 years ago. And at the time, no one had looked at the nectar of coffee flowers to see whether there was actually caffeine in nectar. Because if there's no caffeine in the nectar, then there's really not any interesting question there. We knew from citrus, however, that orange flowers and lemon flowers had caffeine. There was a study done by a group in Germany that was studying caffeine production in the Rutaceae, and it was just this random basic science study of everything found in the plant, and they looked in the nectar, the pollen, the flower, and every other part, and they found caffeine. So when I read that paper, I was like, oh, this is really interesting.
What's it doing in oranges?
Yeah, good question, huh? But that plant actually has the capacity to produce it, and so it's a defensive compound, right, which it's using to prevent herbivory. Interestingly, it also winds up in the nectar and pollen. And so when I was reading, I'm like, oh, that's really curious. And I wasn't the only person, actually, that thought it was interesting. And there were a few other studies done, one by an Israeli group and one by an Australian. And but I wanted to know if other plants also had caffeine in the nectar, especially ones that we know well, like coffee, because you get at a more evolutionary angle if you can find many different species that have co-evolved the same kind of mechanism. It starts to make you think that actually there is some selective pressure for having that as an adaptation. And then the question is, so what does it give you? I mean, why would you do this? Why would you put it in there? It's a toxin. Why would you put a toxin in the nectar? That's the opposite of what you want to do. You want to attract, not repel. So I looked at both of those questions. One of them was to find out if it was in coffee nectar. And I went to Costa Rica because I knew of a research station there that had all these different types of coffee growing. And I asked them if I could go and collect the floral nectar and pollen. They were very generous and allowed me to do it.
Oh,
and so I collected all... Yeah, exactly. It was great. Costa Rica is so good.
Coffee in Costa Rica.
Yeah, awesome. And I went and collected this nectar, and I came back and I went to my friend Phil Stevenson's lab at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. He has this great lab where they have all this equipment and they can measure all these phytochemicals. And we found caffeine in the nectar. And we were able to measure the quantities of caffeine that was present. And using that information...
all the species of different coffee.
It's different. So it depends on the species. Some species don't have it.
Oh, really?
Some species have it in much higher concentration. Yeah. And it's highly variable even within the plant. So some flowers have it and some don't. Depends on the species. I would really like to do a more comprehensive survey of this, but I've never had the time or the funding really to pursue it in greater detail. Maybe in future.
Really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's really cool, isn't it? Anyway, this was a labor of love. I had no funding for this at the time. I just did it because I wanted to. And so I went there, collected this stuff, brought it back, gave it to Phil. We found out how much caffeine was there. And I had some undergraduate students in the lab at the time, training bees, and we were using the concentrations found in nectar to see if they had any impact on the ability of the bee to learn the floral scent. These flowers produce a beautiful scent. It smells like jasmine. It's like really strong, really beautiful.
Wow.
And the same with, I don't know if you've been in an orange grove in springtime. It's just this incredible smell. The flowers are intoxicating. They're just wonderful.
Is it similar to the coffee?
Coffee's more like jasmine. It has a kind of more night blooming jasmine. I don't know exactly what those compounds are. I should know. But they both are flowers that produce a lot of scent, and they produce a lot of nectar, and a lot of pollinators come there. So, and we now know that the amount of caffeine that was found in the nectar of both, we use that information then to train bees with a solution that was like nectar to learn this very simple form of conditioning. Can they learn that a scent predicts food? And what we found was that when you add caffeine to the nectar, they learn a little bit faster, but more importantly, they remember that smell longer if there was caffeine in it. So caffeine is actually helping them to remember the floral scent so that they go back to other plants of the same species and take the pollen to other places.
But conversely, it's, for us, meant to put us off taking those plants.
Well, we don't eat coffee. Most normal people will not eat a coffee bean, right?
Yeah.
If you eat a handful of coffee beans, you'll feel like shit. So pardon for the podcast.
Exactly.
Right? So you don't really eat the coffee beans to get nutrition. What we're doing is we are using it as a drug because in a little amount it feels good. And it does actually increase our attention. And it does actually help us to remember. And in fact, another group took the information from my paper and then did a study in people and showed that there was a small effect on the ability to learn and remember information in humans.
That is a great reason to drink more coffee, and also super interesting.
Yes, isn't it?
As a sort of side, I wonder what the evolutionary purpose of us enjoying floral scents is. Do you know anything about that? Like, why do we smell a flower and think it smells amazing?
I think it's just the consequence of the fact that we have an olfactory system, which it's been produced by natural selection to perform the same kind of task as a bee's sense of smell. And that is to take a complex blend of chemical volatile compounds and form a percept that we can use to identify an object. So it allows us then to we perceive these compounds which are produced by plants, some of which are actually not very good, nice smelling. There are certain plants that smell like carrion, and and that's it. There's a purpose to that. Actually, those carrion flowers, they are trying to get flies to come to pollinate them. So they're using a chemical signal which is meaningful to that fly and deceiving them. In the case of a bee coming to a flower, there's no a priori there necessarily that the flower, those scents produced by flowers have any meaning to that bee. Although very interestingly, a colleague of mine at the University of Zurich has found that, or has a very strong hypothesis that a lot of the scents that are produced by plants actually were originally the pheromones used by these insects as signals. And that helps to attract them to that object in the first place. So bees use all kinds of smells for loads of other purposes, right? They signal to each other through smell. They know the smell of their own colony. They know the smell of their queen. Their queen produces compounds which actually act like drugs to control that colony. The workers themselves communicate through smell. If you get stung by a bee or if there's an intruder, they produce an alarm pheromone that smells like bananas, and that attracts all the other bees and drives them crazy so that they then sting the target. They produce scent to call other bees to a location. Something called the Nasanov pheromone produces this really floral smell that says, come here, and then they smell it and they go there. So they are really olfactory animal.
We know of sort of pheromones as, talking about, we're letting off each other's pheromones and we're sexually attracted to that. But bees, that's like a multitude of their different forms of communication is done that way.
Yes. So it's through scent. You're absolutely right. So in a colony, they're a very olfactory animal that uses these chemical signals all the time to in lieu of language, right? In lieu of the fact that they can't talk to each other, they use scent, and a lot of these compounds or these smells, they have an innate meaning to the animal, right? So it's alarm, whoo, you know what it is. There's no confusing it.
Okay.
But because they have this olfactory system that's tuned to many different compounds, it also enables them then to smell all these weird general things that are in their environment. So the smell of the plants that they might visit for food. A lot of plants emit all kinds of volatile compounds, and insects and animals use those compounds to orient. I mean, like a pine tree, you can smell it from yards away, right? So it's not surprising in a way that plants would have also evolved a chemical signaling mechanism for an insect pollinator, right? To say, look, I'm over here, and come over here. And then it becomes, our sort of separate signal that insect can use to identify food. But just because it's a complex blend of these compounds that we can already detect, we have a system that's pretty much pre-selected to allow us to perceive the flower. There's no relationship necessarily between us and the flower, unless we've bred those plants to produce that, which we do. But in the wild, not necessarily. It's just a consequence of our sort of enlightened state on Earth that flower exists, and we are here at the same time.
And it makes sense as well that flies are attracted to things that we don't like because they,
the smell of carrion, it's a clear, the microbes that produce the rotting sulfur compounds, right?
Yeah.
That's a clear signal of something dead. We know it, flies know it. Flies go there because there's food, and they have evolved the ability to recognize that smell and associate it directly without having to learn it. That there's dead stuff there. What's interesting is that a plant can infiltrate that signal and then take advantage of a fly to pollinate, just simply by smelling like something dead, rotting carcass. You got these flies around, maybe no bees where you are, and then suddenly you've trapped these flies. They get covered in pollen and they go off to another carrion flower. They get confused.
Yeah. Oh my God, so interesting. With the way that bees in hives communicate. And understand each other. Would two bees from two separate hives be able to talk to each other? Do they have like a general language?
So they do have a general language through pheromones. And in addition to that, they can detect the smell of another colony. So, and they're enemies, actually. Although you get drift in bee colonies, especially if the beekeeper's keeping all the colonies near each other. Some bees go there, some go there. And especially if they're all busy and they're all collecting food, they don't mind too much.
Right,
But,
like Europe, you can kind of, move around, but maybe other sides of the world, we're more like...
yeah, a bit like that. But when times get tough, the bees start to pay attention to the smell of their colony nest mates, and there are guards at the entrance, and the guards, they vet everybody that comes through, and they do it by smell, and they can detect if that bee is not a member of their colony, and if they are not, they'll throw them out or try to kill them, because bees will rob each other. So intruders from other colonies will come in and start stealing nectar and honey out of the colony and take it away. So when times get tough, then bees can recognize intruders.
Right, and they can sense other hives and go like, oh, let's see if they've got anything, because we're suffering. Yeah. And like you said earlier about kicking competing bees out in the world, they'll compete.
Yeah, they have to do this with wasps too. Wasps come to bee colonies to kill larvae and to kill adult bees. They eat them. And so they have to be able to detect intruders of that kind too, and to fight them off. There's this huge scare in the U.S. about this Asian hornet. I don't know if you've seen these massive wasps from Japan. They are truly magnificent and scary. But they eat bees. So they will munch through an entire colony. They just basically crunch through and eat the thorax, which is the meaty part of the bee, and throw everything out. I know, it's disgusting. It's incredible. But there's video footage you can see online of bees. Bees have learned to overcome these wasps by jumping on them and heating them up. So they overheat them and basically cook the wasp alive in order to kill it. Because there's no other defense they have. They can't kill that wasp. The wasp is too tough. But that way they can kill it if they all jump on it and burn it.
That must be like, hundreds of bees.
It's hundreds.
Sort of surround.
Yeah, but they can shiver, so they can produce energy that way, or heat that way. They do that in winter. And so they can raise the temperature of the wasp to a point where the wasp can't make it. And that kills it. Is
that something that they've always done? We know that this is a really old defense.
Nope, just those populations that live in Japan where they're under very intense selection by those wasps know how to do this. And that's a problem if you have this wasp invading, the U.S. or Canada, because the bee populations there are not prepared for a predator of that kind. So the wasp could potentially go in and completely destroy those colonies.
Yeah. Do you think there's any chance that we might see that these bees that are unprepared start doing that, and we'll sort of think maybe this is you'd have to allow for selection of the colonies to do that, right? The problem is they're so intensively managed by people that you might not wind up with a situation where that could occur. So you don't have these natural mating populations where basically the wasps are killing off every other colony that can't do it, and only those that have managed to sort that out are the ones that make it. Yeah. So we know that they can sense things that they're really attracted to, and sometimes pesticides can slip through the net because they get, they start to like certain parts that coincide with it. Are they any good at sensing things that are really bad for them, like the bad smelling flowers? Or
that's a great question too. You're asking all the right questions. This is a topic that I'm really interested in, and I have been for a while.
That's great.
My lab is trying to figure out if bees actually have a sense of bitter taste. They can sense some things that taste bitter, but they're not very good at it. And especially because they're drinking some really sticky, sweet drink, if the toxin's actually in something like nectar, it makes it all that more difficult to detect. And it's true for us too. If you don't like the taste of coffee, you just heap in the sugar, right? And then it tastes nice, and you can take it down.
Orange juice to your vodka, and you can get it
down. Exactly. Exactly. We do exactly the same thing, right? We don't want to taste these bitter, nasty things. And but even in the absence of sugar, bees just don't have a taste system that is very good at detecting bitter things. And it's because they haven't really had strong selection on their taste system to have to do this. I mean, they co-evolve with plants as mutualists. The plant is not trying to poison them. The plant's trying to entice them. So it's in an animal that's a herbivore that's eating leaves or eating a bunch of different things like us. We have to be able to taste it and see if it's poisonous and then throw it off if it's bad. Or if we eat it and it makes us sick, we need to be able to associate the taste and smell of that food with the fact we just got really sick from whatever was in it. Bees have these mechanisms. They can learn to avoid the taste and smell of things that are associated with malaise. But they're not very good at first at detecting the actual nasty compound if it's in a really sticky nectar solution. And my lab at the moment is trying to uncover, what is the principle of that? What things can they taste and what things can they not detect at all? So that we have a more complete picture of the bee's bitter taste system.
Right. So, I mean, how are you doing that? What are you using to test whether they...
Well, we can do little behavioral assays where we put a bee in a tube and we give them a choice and we look at their mouth parts, and it's basically the same thing as if you had a blindfold and I kind of put something on your tongue and I asked you if it tasted bitter or not. So we can ask them, in a behavioral assay, can you detect this compound or not? Will you drink it and how much? But we're also interested in the actual neural mechanism of how these things are sensed in the insect taste system and how that information is transmitted to the brain. So we are recording from the neurons that are found in their mouth parts to understand whether they even have the mechanism that allows them to detect these compounds in the first place, and what it is. What kind of mechanism is it? Is it different to mechanisms that exist in other insects? So that's the topic that my lab is currently studying now.
That's incredible. Because I feel like we hear a lot about, bees being sort of like a canary in the coal mine, like pollinators in general. Once we see them suffering, we know that something bad is going on out there. I mean, that's what eventually your work will trickle out to helping people understand that, right?
Well, the work that I'm doing that's applied and that's really looking at the causes for bee decline, I would say that that the fact that we found that these pesticides have such a strong impact on a non-target organism, an animal that we actually really need and depend on for pollination of our crops, and the wild plant species that are important to us too. The fact that we see that people's behaviors and the practices that we have in agriculture are having such a strong impact unintentionally on bees should be taken as a warning signal that we are losing biodiversity of many different organisms, not just bees. And that is absolutely true. We are in an unprecedented time in our history, and we must take account of it. We have a vanishingly small amount of time to do anything, and we must act now, or we will lose vast amounts of biodiversity on this planet, and it will be to our detriment. This is something I think people don't quite understand is, why should we care that we're losing biodiversity? Biodiversity is our wealth. It's our future. It's our children's future. The things we don't even know the consequences of the loss of this biodiversity and how it's going to impact our basic welfare. But the moral reason is that we don't have the right to destroy every living thing on this planet. It is not right for us to not care about the loss of these organisms, and we must start to change this point of view in the human population. Our well-being depends on it. Our future on this planet depends on it.
Mm-hmm. Very, very viscerally. It's not like saying, it's going to be difficult for us, or it's going to be not as beautiful, or we won't be able to have all of these beautiful places. It's like, no, we won't be able to eat food.
We will die.
we won't be able to breathe the air. We won't be able to take a dip in the ocean.
Yeah.
And it's really close.
It is. It's also the difference between living in a survival state and living your best life, right? We all value nature. We all love to be outside in plants and flowers and with animals. These things are things that make our life richer, right? The beauty of the natural world is life itself. Mm-hmm. If we kill it and we do it for profit or for a short-term gain that has to do with the food we waste, with the decisions we make to support a human population, it is a cheap and irresponsible decision. It is one that is basically squandering the wealth of the world for a very short-term gain that is for the benefit of only a few individuals. And I think it's something that we must very seriously address now, before it's too late.
Yeah. How much of like the work that your colleagues do and your peers across the world is now sort of, well, is thinking in this way, is thinking, these things that I'm researching, which may seem insignificant on the surface, it's all building a huge literature to make this way of thinking the only possible way of thinking about the world. Is that what you're finding?
We depend on you. We depend on the media to actually care enough about the work that is being done by scientists to transmit this information to the public so that they know that they need to do something. I think it's very hard as scientists actually to make this translation. We've been asked in recent years by funders to make more of an effort to make our work translatable. And certainly I would say there's been a strong impact on UK science that has moved it in that direction. All of us want to do work that is relevant, that is interesting. We always have this tension between trying to do something that's applied and relevant versus, just our basic curiosity. And there are good reasons for doing both. But I think that that it doesn't take much more evidence, right? It really, we have enough evidence now to act, to do the right thing for the climate, for the biodiversity of the earth. What we need to have is the will in government. And that's not just one government, it's all governments to actually protect and defend biodiversity, to control human populations, to responsibly produce food in a way that is beneficial for us, but that also has some form of stewardship, recognizing that people are going to have to use this land for generations after the current generation. And unfortunately, I think the practices that are currently in place, while people have been trying to change that, are happening too slow. We need to listen to David Attenborough. We need to stop using plastics so much, because those things are destroying biodiversity. We need to start to care about the way that we produce food so that we aren't poisoning every animal in the landscape in order to protect an oilseed rape crop yield of 10%. These things these calculations are made by people who don't care or don't understand the implications of the decisions that they make. And we, as the people, right, of this planet, need as a collective whole to start to care more. And we need people like you in the media to actually go out and help be the champions of this, and to make people aware so that at least people can make more informed decisions about their future and their children's future.
Yeah, that's exactly the point of what I wanted to do with this whole channel, is like talk to people who are finding these really fascinating things about the way the natural world works, and just share that and make it meaningful. Because there's a reason why people love planet Earth, and there's a reason why people love to take a Sunday morning walk through the woods. We love nature, and although it may seem like we're willing to sacrifice it to have, fish and chips or an imported avocado, it's like, no, actually, if people really understood the choice that they were making, I don't think many people would make that choice.
Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, because it is incredible. I mean, going back to bees, maybe. I think there was one other sort of like area that I wanted to talk to you about. Just the way like that we've been talking a lot about bees as individuals, and we talked a little bit about how they communicate in the hive, but I know that you've done lots of research and there's a whole load of understanding about how they work as a whole, right? I think people think of insects and animals like that as sort of very simple on their own, and then as part of their colony or their group, quite complex and quite quite like the way that they work is insane. So how does a hive work?
How does it go from a perfect eusocial society to prevent anarchy? Basically.
Yeah, and how does it go from, how is it one queen who survives all of this time? Like, how is that one bee picked out to lead a whole thousands of bees?
That's a really lovely question, and it has been pursued by many. It turns out that just about any egg that's laid by a queen can become a queen. So that at the time that the egg is laid, it's not determined to become the queen.
Mm-hmm.
What determines whether she becomes a queen or not is what she's fed when she's a developing larvae. So when this was discovered by a scientist in Texas in the 1950s, it really changed beekeeping. It meant that beekeepers could take the eggs that were laid in worker cells, if they were laid within 3 days,
mm-hmm.
and place them into a larger cup or a larger cell, and the bees would think that they had to rear a queen from the eggs that were laid in the worker cells. And so it meant that you could basically produce as many queens as you wanted in a colony, and then you could rear queens and sell them and sell bees that way. It really revolutionized beekeeping, actually, to know that this was fact.
Mm.
And what's interesting about it is that it means that provided that larva gets the right food, she can become a reproductive. So it basically sets her off on a developmental trajectory in which she becomes fecund, and she has fully developed ovaries, and she has a certain number of traits which characterize her as a queen. She has the spermatheca, she's able to mate, she's much larger than the others. If she is born into a worker cell and she gets fed as a worker, she is fed less food, the food is slightly different, and she becomes a worker, and she doesn't have strong ovaries, she can't mate, she doesn't have the apparatus to store sperm, she can't do the deed, as it were, and she also has a totally different physiology. Mm-hmm. So the queen, when she becomes an adult, emerges from her cell, and she'll live for a few days within the colony if there's only one of her. The other queen will probably still be there, her mother, but the new virgin queen will stay, and then she will go out on a mating flight, and she will mate with up to 20 males. So, yeah, in one day.
What a christening.
So yeah, exactly. And they all die as well. I know.
Who needs them?
Quite dramatic in the bee colony. So she does this mating flight. All these males compete to mate with her. They have these really explosive ejaculations. She stores all the sperm. She comes back. And then when she comes back, the old queen takes off with about half the colony to found a new colony. The new queen stays behind in the remaining colony and basically continues it. So the risky behavior is taken over by the old queen. She takes off in a swarm with some of the bees, and there she goes. So, and they found a colony elsewhere.
She only mates once in her life, and then she stays in the
I mean, she may have a few days of mating, but I think on average it's 1 day.
And that sperm from all of these different guys is with her whole life?
So she stores all that sperm in this modified spermatheca, and she can use that sperm to fertilize eggs for her entire life. And in fact, queens basically they start to die when they are no longer fecund. So when they are running out of sperm, basically, or eggs, it's a process probably that's occurring both with their age, but also running out of those things, and she produces less queen pheromone, and eventually she's done for.
So they don't go through menopause like we do. They don't run out of eggs. When they run out of eggs,
that's pretty much it. Yeah. What humans? It's funny, we do, and people have written about this. The fact that we even have a menopause means that older women are valuable in human societies.
Yes.
And so the older individuals remain behind to basically in most early human societies to look after the children of the reproductives. So older women do play an important role in human societies, and that's why they're not basically terminated when they're no longer reproductive, and also not reproductive, for a longer period too. There might be two two different things happening there.
Sort of like a whole generation. I mean, they're a wealth of knowledge and learning, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's why I
Because
was
humans
really,
store all this information in their brains. Exactly.
Yeah. That's why I was really interested in the sort of generational part of within the hive, whether that was something that's significant as how valuable they are. But I guess, does that mean then that in a colony there can be up to sort of 20 or so dads of that sperm? Is she storing all sperm from all these different
so
guys?
it means that it could be that there are 20 different patrolines in any given colony. They're all descended from the same mother, but they may all have different fathers. And there were researchers, a very famous honeybee scientist named Tom Seeley did some really excellent work on this and showed that a honeybee colony that has this level of diversity actually is more adaptive, right? They do better in terms of having diversity in their behaviors and in their immune function that allow them to perform better in the face of environmental stress. So there are reasons why this happens. Now, for a eusocial society, a perfect eusocial society would probably prefer to have one male and one female because they would be the most closely related. But in this case, there's a trade-off made there between the adaptive value of having a diverse population of sisters and being closely related to improve your fitness.
So as long as they're related to the mum and they're all joined in that way, it's actually better to have a little bit of, you're better at this and you're better at that, and then because they have different jobs, you know, sort of assigned from birth, right, in the hive.
Well, actually, every worker in the colony goes through a different behavioral cast throughout its lifetime. So when they emerge as adults, at that time, they're very new and soft and easily influenced by the queen's pheromone. And the ones that actually take care of the queen are always these new bees that come slowly or very soon after their emergence. Within 4 days, they start to eat a lot of pollen, and when they eat pollen, they produce secretions, glandular secretions, that are basically like milk, which they feed to the larvae. So the nurse bees eat all the pollen in the colony that's brought in from the foragers, and they produce this milk for the larvae, and they tend all the larvae, so they're always over there feeding them. They feed the queen, they feed the drones, they feed all of the larvae, and they eat all the food, and they are basically acting like the nursemaids of the colony.
Like a bird will eat and then feed its chicks.
More like a mammalian mother will eat like a steak dinner and then produce milk for her offspring. And the baby doesn't eat the steak, but it gets everything from the steak and the milk. Because the milk is perfect. It's got a perfect casein protein in it. It's got loads of sugar. It's got lots of fat. It's got basically the perfect blend for a baby. And she's made it. Based on all the weird stuff she's eaten, her body's assembled it and then created this perfect food.
Right.
So bees are doing the same thing. They're eating pollen, which may be suboptimal, but they eat lots of different kinds of pollen. They eat some honey, and then they make what is essentially milk, which is basically becomes bee tissue. They don't even have a gut that goes all the way through. So the food just gets absorbed into their tissues. It's even better than milk, actually, because they don't even have to take a poo, right? They just eat it all, and it becomes them. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's the nurse bees. They're the ones that do all the feeding, and then as they age, they get further and further away from the queen. They come to the sort of edge of the colony, and they start to do guarding behavior. They begin to undertake, so they take out the dead ones. They do all this other stuff. They guard, which is slightly more dangerous. And then after they've spent a period doing those behaviors, they're away from the queen. Their fat atrophies, so they lose all their body fat. Their brain, some of the way that their brain is configured changes slightly, and they suddenly have a huge demand for sugar. And because they have no body fat, they're burning sugar. Their flight muscles are ready to go, and they start to do foraging. So the forager is like a super athlete. They really need a lot of sugar all the time, and they are out doing this really highly demanding work, collecting nectar and pollen, and using their brain all the time to do all this learning. So every bee in the colony goes through this ontogeny, where they start as nurses and they eventually become foragers and guards and then foragers.
Right. So they sort of go through this journey. They all work like that. That is so amazing. And I mean, to what extent are they sort of, do they sort of think about things in terms of what's good for the hive? You know, are they part of the hive, or do they have selfish needs as well? Like when they're out foraging, are they like, oh, just have a little bit for myself? And
well, they have to. So they have to have a little bit for themselves, or they'll die.
The snacks.
But they are trying to optimize the amount of food that they are bringing back versus what they need. So they only take enough food on board before they leave to get to where they need to go. And then they have spare to collect, and then they bring it back. So there is this you're right, this is always optimization. And there is always, in any social society, there's always tension between what's best for you versus what's best for the group that you're a member of. And this, you know, as we previously talked about, this is a very special form of socialism called eusociality, true socialism, where you have one reproductive individual and all the others are related to that individual in a very close way. And that's how this type of society it's only possible to evolve this kind of society when you have inclusive fitness that arises as a result of the cooperative membership of that group. So in fact, if you are more related to your sisters than you would be to your own offspring, then it becomes advantageous for you to form a society where you're rearing your sister's children in order to have some kind of advantage. And when they work as a group, they can get more food, they can do all of these incredible behaviors like kill off predators or keep themselves warm or store food or rear the larvae in a more beautiful way, right, in a really reliable way. These kinds of behaviors and these kinds of societies can evolve. It's kind of a higher level society. It's the same as us, right? We have all these amazing equipment, you know, this iPhone and this computer, and, you know, we can do all these things. We have medicine. These things arise from our ability to work as a unit, right? Because we share information and we work together to a common goal. It means that we can specialize in our societies. We have teachers and we have firemen and, you know, we have airplane pilots and, you know, we have everybody contributing to the society, and all of those parts make a greater sum than their individual pieces. If every individual had to do all their own food collection and all their own teaching of their kids and all these other things, we couldn't do it, right? And that's, you know, historically, that's maybe what we came from. But we really live at a time now where we have a critical mass of well-educated people that can do all these amazing things. And it means that our culture actually then permits each individual to have opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. Same in a bee colony. I mean, they have a much safer, much more stable, and much more adaptive organism when all of them work together. And that's how this has evolved.
Yeah, I just wish that like bees don't question it, whereas we seem to think that, you know, some people prefer a dog-eat-dog sort of world and sort of forget that we work better if we stick together.
Well, you know, it's funny. There are always, this is really the heart of life on Earth. There are, whenever it benefits an individual to cooperate, then a cooperative scheme will evolve. Whenever it's more beneficial to work as an individual, then those selfish interests will evolve. And that's been a huge a topic of interest for biologists since Darwin. It's really important to understand the nuances of the conditions that give rise to cooperative behavior versus selfish behavior, and what kinds of conditions then promote those different things. Because in certain situations, we have to be selfish or else, or not. And we can't expect humans to act the same way as bees because we don't have the same inclusive fitness. You won't be rearing some random person's kids, right? Because it's not, you know, unless you really want to have a child and you can't have your own. And there's some benefit to you of that, you know, psychologically, because you don't have any direct outcome, right? There's no real, you know, in a really core, like, visceral, I'm a living being way, you have no positive outcome. So always in our societies we have to think carefully about how we construct human societies such that we don't put people in a conundrum where they are being forced to do things which are not to their own interest, right? Because then they will find ways to cheat, or you have to punish those that cheat. And it's not true to say that a honeybee colony doesn't have cheaters, because it does, and people have studied this. Yes, and there are anarchic honeybee societies, and they do evolve, and there are cheaters that will lay eggs that are drone laying workers. So
and why? What do they get out of it?
If they go undetected as layers of eggs, then they are basically benefiting. They are improving their own individual fitness. But it's very heavily policed within that colony in order to allow a eusocial society to evolve. So workers punish other workers by eating the eggs and beating up the worker that does the laying. If she's perceived to actually even produce pheromones like a queen, which some of these sort of semi-queens do, she can be killed. So they're very careful about policing within the colony in order to keep that social cohesion.
So similar with us, we have, this is what we think is right, and this is how we can achieve the most as a whole, and then anything that doesn't fit into that, we're gonna shut it down.
We have to have laws in order for there to be a social agreement or a contract amongst all of us, right?
Yeah.
We have to have those things where we agree to treat each other in certain ways, or else we can't work as a cooperative system. And as long as most people are obeying that and working within those confines, you'll have a cooperative society that benefits everyone. The problem comes when people are able to cheat that particular setting, and they do so to their own massive benefit relative to everyone else.
And then we can live a much better life, like you said before. So what is, maybe to sort of round off here, your work is obviously, we've sort of been through the different areas that you're looking into. What else are people sort of trying to figure out when it comes to bees? What's the future? Because it seems like studying bees has been sort of like, at least 100 years, and beekeeping before, I think, is quite an ancient trade, right? What lies ahead as we try to understand and help the bees?
I think one of the really interesting questions in neuroscience at the moment is to understand what a small insect brain can do, and what the differences really are between a large complex brain like ours and a small brain like a honeybee's brain or a fruit fly's brain can do. We're at a place in the history of science where we're starting to get a handle on how these brains are built, basically. In flies, we now have a complete atlas of the fruit fly brain, and it was a huge achievement to get to a point where we know how all these neurons are wired and where they connect and what they do, and now it's taking that information and really working out what a brain is and how it functions and why it is the way it is. There are a lot of really great questions that are going to arise from research of this kind. And I think in the future, bees are really sophisticated. And compared to a fruit fly, they do all kinds of interesting things like communicate, and they navigate, and they have all this amazing behavior. And it will be fascinating if we have the tools to understand how their brain is built, to work out what those circuits, the design of those circuits, those kinds of things can inform AI. They give us real insight into the way our own brains work and the nature of neural circuits. I think that's a really exciting area in the future, and at least in one very small area of bee science.
Yeah, I mean, because they make up so many of the brains that are on Earth, right? Insect brains.
Yes, that's right. But a lot of what we learn about the way an insect brain works, the principles are the same in our own brains. Many of them are shared. Even if the architecture itself is not exactly the same, we have to do the same kinds of things. So trying to understand how a neural circuit solves that problem is really a fascinating area of research. And I believe that major insights are going to be arriving in the next 10 years from what we know about insect brains in terms of how a brain functions.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I hope to get to talk to you again about it in a few years when when we know some more. Thank you so much. It's been so great talking to you.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Covered so much. I feel like there's a whole sequel to this of, different the ways things impact bees and what lies ahead for them as we keep doing things in the world.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of something else you would like me to help out with, I'm more than happy to.
Oh, that's so.
I also have other
Thank
friends
you.
too, and I'm sure that would be interested to talk to you if you wanted other sources for information.
I would love that. I think, I'll have a look and see.
I'll send you an email, and I can just, I'll mention a
Yeah.
few names of people that I know that you might be interested to talk to about specific subjects.
Yeah.
So if you choose to.
That would be so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really nice to
Thanks
talk to you.
so much.
You have some great questions.
Yeah.
You have a really curious mind. It was fun.
I really do. I'm trying to imagine it in my head and then bring it back each time.
I hope you get a chance to go to the tropics, because the tropics are really amazing for all animals of all kinds. Yeah.
Yeah, blow your mind, and go as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
and please email me, and we'll talk to you again.
All right. I'm gonna go and have lunch.
Cool.
You're warming me out.
You must be hungry.
All
Thank
right.
you
See you
so
later.
much. Enjoy.
Okay, bye-bye.
See ya.